Mm-hmm.
Welcome, Tom Bushlack. Thank you for joining us on the Lose Your Narc online retreat. I'm so happy and honored that you're here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me. I'm honored to be invited.
Hey, you know what? We have a funny story, and I want to go ahead and tell it because maybe by the time people are seeing this interview, they will have heard a lot about how they create the reality and how fun synchronicities can be and how life can surprise you. And I'll start the story off how I met Tom and his soccer entourage. And so I had lost my job and I was Ubering, and I just needed something to do to keep myself moving because I'm used to traveling a lot. And I love driving. And so I download the Uber app. And normally in an Uber situation, if you're the driver, you might get a bing for a call and it's a mile or so away. But this time I got a bing and it was like 8 or 10 miles away. Like, I lived in Dogtown, which is near Forest Park in St. Louis, and he was all the way down by Busch Stadium, right?
Yeah.
And so I get the link and I was like, what the F is this? Like 10 miles or 8 miles or whatever it was. And I was like, huh. And normally I would have been like, nope. But that day I felt nudged and I went ahead and I said, okay, I'll get in the car and I'll go down to Busch Stadium. And then what happened on your end?
Well, so what's funny is I remember standing on the corner with my wife and a couple of friends that we had gone to see the U.S. men's soccer team play a friendly. And I remember the same thing, calling an Uber and it showing, you can see where the person is coming. I remember showing it to my wife. I was like, that is so weird. That's really far away. Why would they, we're downtown. There should be a lot of Ubers around.
Yeah.
But we stood there and waited, and then you pulled up.
You guys got my Jeep and we started chatting, and I come from the seminar industry and Tom was moving into the seminar industry as a leader and speaker. And so we kind of hit it off, and shortly thereafter we were having coffee and talking about such things and connecting dots. And here we are now. You're on the Lose Your Narc conference. We found out that we both had a history with narcissism, and you can share whatever you want about that. You don't have to share anything, but if you want to share it, you're welcome to do that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I probably won't name names just because this will be out there publicly. But I certainly have had experiences with people who have, let's say, even without a diagnosis, strongly narcissistic tendencies, which to me is sort of defined by this inability to differentiate themselves from me or others, and have any kind of concept that there are other people out there in the world that might have needs that are different from their own. So I've had to do some pretty intense work, some of it in therapy and some of it that comes out of my own spiritual practice that I'll talk about. So yeah, I've had to do some of that work to sort of disentangle myself from some of those relationships. And they've come in my own story, both in family and in professional contexts where that's gotten sticky. I sometimes, for some reason, people might remember the children's book about the tar baby. Do you remember that book?
No.
It was like the Briar Rabbit.
Oh, yeah,
the tar baby, and he punches this tar baby because he's trying to defend himself, but it's tar, so his fist sticks, and it's like the more he punches, the more he gets sucked in. And I think that's often the experience that I've had and other people sometimes have of dealing with someone who has, whether it's a diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder or just those tendencies, is that we have the best of intentions. And we go about being in a relationship the way we think the rules are supposed to be played in the world. But then the next thing you know, you're getting sucked in further and further. And then it takes a lot of work to disentangle ourselves, or I guess the more technical language that I use is differentiate ourselves out of that situation back into a safe space.
I like that. I like that word disentangle, though. You do have to like unravel from the unraveling. Actually.
Yeah. And the challenge is, of course, that it can unravel you in that process, because if you're sort of prone to getting, I don't know what the right, I will not be using sort of proper psychological terms here. I'm speaking more out of my own experience.
Sure.
Some of it is based in research that I did when I was in my professor days, but with my background in theology and ethics, not in psychology and personality. But out of my own experience and my spiritual practice. But yeah, it's like some of us tend to be more prone to getting sucked in to those worlds, and then only after some damage is done that we realize, oh, I need to try to step away from this or pull myself out.
Yeah. So tell me about the work that you've been doing.
Yeah. So the primary thing that I'm doing now is I'm helping executives and other leaders get out of overwhelm and burnout quickly through a spiritual practice and get reconnected in their purpose so they can save their health, their relationships, and their careers. And I tend to do that with a very spiritual approach, so guided by a divine wisdom or some kind of a higher wisdom. So that's the process that I work with people. And, I think the primary pain point that the people I work with come to me is it's usually leaders and executives who are struggling with overwhelm and burnout. But what's fun is invariably when we get into our work together and we start kind of getting into the spiritual practice and applying it in people's daily lives, is that they start to recognize how much their own self-knowledge is changing and how that changes the way they show up in their relationships. And that often leads to an awareness of places where they have not been setting boundaries and maybe need to, because they start to, I call this process centering for wisdom. So it's this idea that when we get in touch with this inner core of wisdom that we all have, and for me, everybody has it, right? It's sort of innate to human beings and human dignity. And if you come from this from like a faith or spiritual perspective, God put it there, or we were all born with this innate ability. But we all have these experiences that get us stuck or attached or suffering in different ways. So that can be overwhelm. It can be a narcissistic relationship. It can be trauma. And when we get kind of caught up in that, we lose touch. We start to give our energy out and give it away and give our power away. And then we lose touch with that inner core of wisdom. So this process of centering is using a spiritual practice that's very simple. Anybody can do it. Anybody can learn it. But it's about integrating it into daily life. And then once you integrate the practice kind of into your own routine, then it's about, okay, now you start getting in touch with that inner core of wisdom, that divine center, if you will. And then the goal is to live out of that space and to bring that centered and aligned and purposeful energy into everything that you do. So that includes narcissistic relationships, if you happen to be in one. It includes your own health, physical, mental, and spiritual, and then it includes professional life. So what I find really fun is those unexpected moments where somebody maybe will sign up to work with me primarily out of maybe a health reason or a professional or a business reason, trying to save their career. And then I get that email, and it's usually right around a month or so of working together where they say, I just had this amazing insight about how I'm relating to my partner or my spouse or my kid or somebody at work, and how I'm showing up with this different energy and how it's changing the way we communicate. And often that starts by noticing where people aren't setting appropriate boundaries, and that when they do, it feels scary, right? And I think this applies even more so to a narcissistic relationship, because if and everybody listening knows, if you rock the boat of a narcissist, they're going to go on the offensive and they're going to accuse you of things. They're going to blame you for things. They're going to, I'm trying to think of the coworker that I had where I had this challenge. I finally kind of drew some boundaries and put my foot down around some things at work. And she just accused me on Monday morning. She said, I have had a migraine all weekend and it's all because of you.
You are so powerful.
And I thought, I see where this conversation is going, because all I did was speak my truth and ask for a boundary. I don't believe I caused your migraine. But that, of course, that conversation is moot with a narcissist.
Right.
Point being, having that ability to start, there's that fear of, oh, if I set a boundary with somebody, then they're going to be angry with me. And if the person truly is a narcissist, that probably is the outcome. But then if we have enough support, so the spiritual practice kind of builds up this inner core and this inner strength, but we also need a lot of supportive relationships. I'm a firm believer, and I don't consider what I do with Centering for Wisdom any kind of like magic bullet where people wouldn't need other kinds of support, like a therapist or a counselor, or just good friends that they can rely upon. Even medications can all be part of that. But that it gives us that sort of inner courage to state that boundary, and start that process of differentiating or disentangling from where we get stuck in the relationship. And that's hard. It's super hard. And a lot of what I do as a coach is really, I mean, a lot of it is like teaching the practice is like easy, right? It's more like, oh, here's how I'm going to support you in bringing that new energy and that new wisdom into these different areas of your life. So that's where I think the real challenge is.
So let's go back a little.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of dumped a lot there.
Yeah, there's like 14 things there. So let me go back. So there's the new student learning new ways to tap into their own inner wisdom. And with that, one example is they're going to be setting some boundaries. That's scary. And the narcissist, if we're in that situation, and since this conference is about that, let's go with that situation.
Yeah.
For example, the narcissist may lash out. It may seem angry, but the fuel for that narcissist is actually shame, number one,
right,
and fear that they're about to lose their supply, the narcissistic supply. And so if you set a boundary, that's like, well, wait a minute. I'm the one who controls stuff here. I'm the narcissist. I control the stuff. And I control what we do here. And so if someone in our audience is facing that, and they're in this new scary little practice of their own, right? Like it's new. They're going to be wonky. They're not going to be perfect at it. But if you were coaching them, what would you tell them if they're in that? They may be in a dangerous situation, but
yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
How do you help them navigate that? Like, what would you say to them? Like, how important is it to learn how to set boundaries? How important is it?
I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, 12.
14.
Yeah, 14, 15. Yeah. I think the more that I have learned that, and I will own my own process here, is like, I get how scary that is. And to answer your question as you phrased it before, because I think it's really important, I haven't personally experienced a situation where I was coaching somebody who was setting a boundary where it was clear that that person was like a raging narcissist that was going to put them in physical harm. So I have to just kind of disclaimer, like, I haven't done that.
Yeah.
I can imagine a scenario like that. And if I were coaching somebody in that situation, I would be mostly, as their coach, focused on how are they getting in touch with their own sort of need to set a boundary. But then I would really want to be sure if I were supporting them through that kind of a process of starting, and it's a process. It's not like as you know, you don't just set a boundary with a narcissist that you have a relationship with and then walk away, because it's the tar baby, right? You're entangled. So starting that process, I would really want to be sure, and I would probably ask a lot of questions. What are your other supports that you have? What are you getting professional help with a counselor? Are you do you have other people in your life, maybe family members, close friends, siblings, somebody who's going to have your back or that you can go to, particularly if somebody's in physical danger at that level.
let's just say right now, if you're in danger, you go call the police. If you're suicidal, you call the suicide hotline.
Yep.
If you're in danger, you might need to call a shelter or leave. So let's just say that right now, right here. And
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
that's
Yep.
the thing, if that's what's happening, but what you're saying is, who is your tribe? Who is your team? Who's your real team?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So I would want to really identify who those people are and make sure that people that the person was communicating with that tribe in really clear ways, so that they're not, because I think where we can get lost really easily, especially if we've been pulled into these kinds of relationships, because let's face it, I mean, having been in some of these relationships, it really fucks with your sense of reality, right? Because you get pulled into the narcissist perspective.
Mhm.
And so that's why I think having that tribe and that community to be able to start having conversations, and say, I don't feel safe. And that can be just emotionally safe, because that's a real level. Even if a person isn't violent or threatening in a particular way, or other kinds of, physical safety, things like that. But people that you can go to, have that conversation with, and then have an honest conversation. Here's my plan. Here's how I'm going to approach this. And I did this a lot. I happened to be in a recovery program at that time, so I had a sponsor that I was talking with, particularly when I did this with some family members. I had a really incredible, amazing, supportive wife, and still have her, thankfully. And I had other friends that I was able to go to. I had a recovery group, a 12-step group. I had other people who were kind of part of my prayer and meditation group, where I do the centering prayer and meditation. So like all those people that were, like, hey, we got your back. And it was slow. It's like you kind of start drawing some lines. And it was only much later, after we had done a bunch of work, that it came to a point of like, no, we're putting a hard line here. And really having to deal with the consequences of that.
So first of all, congratulations on all that work. Like that, I didn't know some of that. That's amazing work. I've been through some of the same recovery kind of programs, so I get like how, like it truly is a 12-step, steps, right? Steps. It's not
Yeah.
some big
Yeah.
leap. There's no instant gratification here.
No.
Look, everyone who is on this conference are either a victim or have been victimized by a narcissist, are currently a victim in active narcissism, or they're a family member of a narcissist, or someone who's being victimized by a narcissist. And
Yeah.
they want help right this second. And it's just, we already talked about it before about untangling, like it takes a while to untangle. If you're stuck out in, a bunch of barbed wire, it takes some while, and some caution and some wisdom to and discernment, rewiring. The people on this call have been, I call it brainwashed. They've been brainwashed, and this conference is an opportunity to brainwash yourself. And I say that kind of sassy, but it's really truly a rewiring or reprogramming, and it takes deliberate steps. It takes people like Tom coming on. He's already done the work. He's still doing the work, but he has a program and he has proof because he's done it over and over and over with clients. Those are the people that you need to be listening to, not someone with an agenda to make sure that they get to keep you as a source of supply, right? So
I think that's a real key thing that in our prior kind of warm-up conversation before we hit record here, and I heard you say it again, and I don't think I quite ever put it in those words before, but I think that's a really, to me, that's a very insightful and accurate way of putting it. And now remind, how did you put it again? I'm blanking.
what?
Um, it was the way you talked about putting those pieces in place. It was a phrase that you used. Shoot, it'll come back to me in a second.
I probably made it up. I don't know. I'm just
Well, whatever. If you did make it up, it was helpful. I'm sorry, my brain's a little fried.
It'll come
So
to you when we start talking some more. You just
it'll
blurt it
come
out.
back to me. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, the thing is, so
Oh, it was the. I'm sorry. It was the being brainwashed.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, that whole idea of being brainwashed. And then you talked about, being brainwashed in a new way, through a conference like this, which, again, not a magic bullet, but could be a starting point for some people of starting that process of disentanglement. And if I were to use the language that I come at it from the spiritual practice piece, I would talk about that as starting to uncover all those layers that we've placed over our heart, to protect ourselves. And if we've been in abusive relationships, let's just recognize that those are there for a reason. They've been there. Those walls have been put up to protect us, and we can even thank those walls and thank ourselves for putting them there.
Thank you,
As
Walt.
opposed to, because it's so easy to get caught up in shame if we're in these kinds of relationships and start blaming ourselves, particularly if there's trauma involved. So it's important, I think, as we do this, to say, thank you, younger self or earlier self, for putting those things in place. And now, as I start to move in a healthier direction, I want to sort of awaken to the deeper, truer me, the true self. And I would say self with a capital S in this case. It's that divine self. It's where that core of wisdom resides. So as we start to get in touch with that, I love the image of kind of like warming that heart center. It starts to melt some of those barriers, but that we can only do that. We can only awaken to that if we have that safe community around us. Because if we're still constantly putting ourselves back into a traumatic or a threatening situation, those walls are just going to come up again. And they're actually doing what they were designed to do. But they ultimately keep us trapped. So the compassion here is, how can we reach out and build community with each other in a way that says, hey, we got each other's backs. We can build an alternative system to that other abusive narcissistic system, where the true self is safe to come out and play.
Oh, I love that.
And that's a beautiful thing when that starts to happen, because then you start to see all the gifts, and even the gifts that can come from the trauma and the abuse. And I don't say that to I'm really careful about saying, oh, everything, this is happening for a reason and you'll be fine. A lot of that can become bullshit real quick.
Whatever.
Yeah, I'll put it this way. When my wife and I first went to therapy, and we were very young in our marriage, we were uncovering some addictive, destructive patterns that I had. I remember the very first therapist that we saw said, you might come to a moment in your marriage where you're actually grateful for this. Mm. And she said, I know that where you're sitting right now, that sounds insane. Yeah. And I would imagine that perhaps some people listening to this are thinking the exact same thing. But I think we've actually come to that point, but it's taken years of work, and our relationship is stronger because of it. But I don't say that lightly. And it was a lot of work and a lot of grace to get there.
I want to say a couple things about that. One, I grew up Catholic, but then I went on to I was just searching because my experience in Catholicism was a little abusive. So of course that was repelling. So I was just searching. I ended up with a degree in philosophy and world religions, and but still searching. But through all that searching, I learned a lot. But I ended up in truly locally metaphysical gatherings, and had wonderful mentors, and started learning about, that being grateful for, things when you're going through them, to the point where even the last narcissistic attack that I had, which started 2 years ago, when the big bomb dropped and it was painful, I thought I was at an okay place in my life, but I was surprised I wasn't. But what happened is I literally was like rubbing my hands together, like, ooh, this is going to be a juicy bit of growth for me. And all the big shitstorm and the pain didn't hit me yet. Just a new bit of information was all I knew, right? I didn't know about the grief that was coming. I didn't know about all that. But there is, if you go through this enough, and I teach some of my friends and clients this, that like, look, you just went through that thing you were so fretting about. Now we're on the other side of it. And you look back and you go, oh, wow, that wasn't so bad. Or, hey, look what I got to be. And look who I get to be now. And so I've been through enough of those scenarios that now I kind of I jump over some of it. I still have to go through it. Like I still had to go through the pain of the past 2 years. But initially I was like, I knew a shitstorm was coming. I immediately called a new therapist and said, I need to book with you and I will be seeing you every week for probably 2 years.
and good for you, right? That's really, that's wisdom, right? That's knowing what your body is going to tell you what you need for that safety.
Yeah.
Because you knew the threat was coming.
And I knew the threat was coming, and I eliminated any excuses to go to that therapist, to include, I got him in walking distance of my home.
Yeah.
So if I couldn't drive and my car broke down, there's no reason I'm not going to the therapist this week.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that. And then I wanted to say, and this comes wisdom over the ages of, I learned from wisdom of the ages, and then also just implementing it, is that those dark times suck, yes, but if you're in a space where you feel awful, you can look at that, you can objectify it and go, hey, thanks. I needed to know exactly what I don't want.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can put that stamp on that, like, I don't want that, pointing to my fingers, I don't want that. Well, now I know that. So now I can turn my ship towards what I do want.
Yeah.
And that contrast is valuable. And so instead of saying everything happens for a reason and like, oh, you'll get past this, well, like nobody wants to hear that shit when you're in it,
Yeah.
But if you can use it, like, I'm going to use this to expedite my road out of here because this is bullshit.
Yeah.
Now, I don't need to be in this abuse. And how do I do this? At least acknowledge where you're at by saying thank you for it and go, okay, thanks, contrast. Now I can turn my ship at least. So if I'm that person coming to you, then now where do you take me with the practice that you do? And I just want to give you the floor for a while and just really tell us about the centering for wisdom.
Okay. I really want to answer that question, but I'm dying to respond to what you
sorry,
just said.
I jumped ahead.
No, it's just, this is good stuff. So I love it. Two thoughts that came to my mind. One is Carolyn Meese, who's a very powerful spiritual teacher,
Love her.
says that if we can say thank you in the dark night of the soul, that we've reached a really profound depth of spiritual maturity.
Woo!
And but I also want to add, like, for people watching, if you're not there, that's okay. Don't shame yourself, right? Yeah. That's just it's a sign of the Carolyn Meese, I think, comes out of the Christian tradition, though she's very open to many traditions. Yes. She's very similar to my own path and teaching, which I'll talk about in a second. But the other thing that reminded me of is in the Buddhist tradition, the Bodhisattva vow. And part of that vow is to say that whatever happens in my life, there's a simple prayer: may this serve to foster my awakening. Mm. And so the pain, the contrast, the grief, may this, it sucks. And there's no denying that. May it foster my awakening to my true self.
Yes.
And then it gives it a deeper layer of meaning and I think a layer of hope while we go through that.
I love that.
And then one other thing you said too is that you use the word grief, and I think that's part of what we can't skip in the process, because oftentimes, we genuinely love these people who turn out to be narcissists.
Yes.
And that's unfortunate and tragic in all kinds of ways. And even as we know, and this was a big challenge for me when I went through this kind of disentangling, even as I knew that it was the right thing to do to distance myself from that relationship, there was a tremendous amount of grief that I had to process. And this gets into your next question about the actual process of centering for wisdom. There is a processing of grief that happens in that as well.
Let me
Go
add to
ahead.
your grief statement before you go there. Sorry, I threw
Yeah.
too much at you. And so we do genuinely love, it could be a boss that love bombed us and we just love that relationship, or a coworker. I've had both. It could be a lover, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, mom or dad, whoever. Somebody has love bombed this person that's on our conference. They've love bombed. They were the best thing
Mm.
since sliced
Yeah.
bread.
That love bombing is
So what
powerful.
happens is, in that process, the narcissist is actually mirroring the victim, because they don't have a self. They take all the best qualities of this person and they go, look, here's who you are. You love me so much because we're just alike. And
Yeah.
what happens is the victim actually falls in love with the narcissist, but they're truly falling in love with themselves. Then the
Mm.
narcissist goes away because they discard them and they're like, oh my gosh. And what they don't realize is, well, initially the first hit is they think they miss the narcissist, but they miss who they get to be with the narcissist. There's that.
Ah, yes.
Then they
And
miss,
that's where that getting in touch with that true self can become so
yes,
powerful.
yes, and it takes a little time.
Yes.
And then hopefully they realize, oh wait, I was falling in love with myself. I finally love myself. And
Yeah.
I remember the moment that I kept hearing it. I kept hearing about self-love, self-love, self-love. And I wasn't getting it. I wasn't getting it because I didn't have any, And then
Yeah. It's hard to, yeah.
well, what? I got nothing. And so eventually though, I remember walking and like it coming up through me somehow, like, oh, this is truly a journey of self-love. And the narcissist is that gift that goes, hey, asshole, I'm going to make you love yourself.
Wow. I love the way you flip that. And I think it nuances what I just said in a way that I didn't say, that's necessary, which is we grieve the loss of that other person, but we also grieve the loss of the sense of self that we had in that relationship.
Yeah.
And it's only at first that to the ego, it sort of feels like death, which is why it's so crushing. But it's only with some time that what we can realize is, oh, that wasn't my true self. And the grieving and letting go of that is what allows us to then uncover our true voice, our true needs and desires, that true self that resides within.
I think it's important to state here right now that it's so important, if you're just getting out of a narcissistic situation, whether it's with a boss or whoever, do not jump into new relationships until you
Yeah.
get that lesson, because you will repeat it. Someone else will love bomb you, then you'll fall in love with that love bombing, and you'll still miss the opportunity to just love yourself. And when you can love yourself, and you can come up with your own philosophy on how you should be treated, you will never ever tolerate this ever again in any relationship, any way, shape, or form. And you're going to need some tools. And so that's why Tom's here to teach you his tool, one of his main tools, I'd say.
Yeah, that actually fits remarkably well with your question about the process. So,
Yes.
yeah. So the first thing I do with people, well, I have an assessment that I use with people. So that first week when I start working with someone, we use that assessment to kind of create a baseline. Where are you most not centered? Where are you feeling most distracted? And that can be, it can be stress and overwhelm in a professional context. It can be relationships. It can be your own kind of internal mental health. So we get a clear picture of that. And then I introduce people to this practice called centering, prayer, and meditation. Some people listening might be familiar with it. I didn't create the actual spiritual practice, but I did go through a process about 10 years ago to be a commissioned presenter of it through contemplative outreach. I learned it, like almost 25 years ago now in college, which is not normal. Most people don't learn about it until much later in life. So in some ways that was a gift. So I've been doing it myself, and I teach the practice. It's the practice itself is really very simple. And it involves choosing a sacred word and then sitting down for 20 to 30 minutes a couple times a day. That's the ideal. Most people don't start off the bat, doing it perfectly. And I have to encourage people frequently, like, not to shame bomb themselves, like, oh, I'm doing it wrong. I always tell people, you can't do it wrong. You can't. It's impossible, because you're sitting down, and the basic practice is whenever a thought arises, and thoughts can refer to the thinking mind as we typically think of it, but it can also refer to a physical sensation in the body. It could be a memory, could be a flashback, could be just your to-do list that's coming up, or it could be something in the future that you're kind of worried about or thinking about. But whatever it is, whatever the thought is that comes up or sensation, we simply recognize it and then repeat our sacred word back to ourselves. And that word is a symbol. It's not a mantra. A mantra practice is a little bit different. But the word itself becomes a symbol of saying yes or accepting whatever is arising in the moment. So we drop our resistance. And I'm sure for many people who struggle with trauma and abuse, we know what it feels like to have that constant tension and fear in our body. So we start to train ourselves to drop, in a safe context, to drop the resistance, to simply notice the thought gently. And I always emphasize the word gently.
Yeah.
Return to the sacred word as our symbol of saying yes to whatever is arising. And then it can be done from any kind of spiritual background. For people who come at it from a faith perspective, the added dimension is that it also becomes a symbol of our saying yes to God's presence and action within, or to the action of grace within. So there's a deeper level of healing. And that's really the practice. What happens over time is the thoughts that kind of come down the river of consciousness, and I like that image. There's a couple images we use. One is like boats coming down a river and we're sitting on the river watching it come by. The other one is like bubbles forming on the bottom of a pan that's about to boil, and one of them just releases. That's a thought going by. Mm-hmm. And when we do the practice, we just watch those thoughts. And it's only when we notice that we're really starting to engage, like, oh, I wonder who's driving that boat. I wonder where that boat is going. I wonder why I feel this way when I see that boat. It's when we start to engage, that's when we notice that mental process, and gently, always gently, come back to the sacred word and let it go. And then it's about, really from there, staying curious. What happens when I don't engage those thoughts that keep coming down the river? And over time, we start to see patterns. And by disengaging from them, we can slowly start to let them go and unravel. And eventually, there's a kind of uncovering that happens. Most people that I work with who have never done the practice go through a couple phases at the beginning. The first one is, every time I talk to them, they have a list of 10 things about why they're doing it wrong. And then I have to just remind them that you can't do it wrong.
Put your shame thrower away.
I know, but it's hard. I mean, and I own this too. I mean, I've got deep shame. But you learn to just recognize even the thought I'm doing it wrong is just another thought.
Yeah.
That I return to my sacred word and I say yes to the present moment. And again, if you're coming at it from a belief in a higher power of some kind, you're saying yes to the divine presence and action to allow that deeper healing. So that's one that people often say is, I'm doing it wrong, and you can't do it wrong. And then the other one that people will, especially at the beginning, it's like, wow, why? I'm just sitting there, like nothing's happening. Why am I doing this? This is dumb. I should just get up and like move on. Yeah. Which again is just another thought.
I have stuff to do.
Yeah. And there is a discipline to it, which again is why I've built in kind of the coaching around it, right? To support people. What inevitably happens, and I mentioned this earlier, it's different for everybody. So I don't want to make this sound like a rule, but it's usually around a month or so in, 4 to 6 weeks. I will always encourage people, like, get the practice, get it regular, find where it fits in your schedule, and then be curious and pay attention to what's happening in your daily life. And the moment where the practice gets, it sticks, if you will, in a good way, like where it becomes meaningful, is when somebody shows up and they're like, I noticed that my boss gave me that look where she raised her eyebrow in the same way my mother used to, that used to send me into a shame cycle for 3 weeks, and I'd think I was going to be fired. I noticed it and I let it go. And I didn't go through that same cycle, and that's the moment where we're like, okay, now boom, we're going to work with that, because that's where the transformation happens. And it's actually not in the experience that happens when people do the centering prayer and meditation for those 20 to 30 minutes. That experience is actually, what we teach is that that's irrelevant. What is relevant, or where the real transformation shows up, is those things in daily life where we're like, oh, I am showing up as a different person with a different energy. And, in the language that I would use, more centered in my true self, more in tune with a higher wisdom. And that you talked about this earlier. If you do some of this work, and again, I don't say this is a magic bullet. So I would imagine if somebody's in a really abusive relationship, this would be in tandem with other things like therapy, yes, and a healing community and healthy relationships and all of that. But then the piece that we work on a little bit later, after the practice is a little more established, is, I call it getting in touch with like your root why, or your core purpose. Mm-hmm. And that applies to relationships too. So that's where you can start to say, these are the things that I will not tolerate in a relationship. And this is what it feels like in my body. I'm very focused on this as an embodied practice. It's not a rational exercise. It's a physical practice. This is what it feels like when people violate that boundary. And this is how you come up with a plan. This is how I'm going to respond if I get into a situation where I see that pattern starting to repeat. And that's where you can start to course correct with help and guidance from trusted people. And that's where that true wisdom starts to come into play. And it's not perfect. It's a lifelong process, but that's kind of the somewhat long overview.
In a nutshell version. Well,
yeah,
it sounds like based on your experience that the results can be actually predictable if someone's actually doing the practice. Like,
to a certain extent. Yeah. There are certain things that I've been doing this enough now, and particularly since I started doing this in the coaching model, because I used to, and I still do more like large workshops where we just teach the practice and then I never see people again.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, one of the reasons I started this as a coaching program was I started having these experiences where I would run into people at random places. Often it would be at a church or something, or sometimes the grocery store, and somebody would come up to me and they'd be like, I was at your centering prayer intro workshop 5-10 years ago. And I would say, oh, how's your practice going? And every single one of them would be like, I don't do it anymore.
I don't have that practice.
And it's like, it's not because they're weak or, sinful or whatever. It's because they didn't have that support that they needed to integrate it into your life. And once you have the taste of what that's like, then this is part of what I can sort of predict, is that it goes from feeling like a chore or something on the to-do list to, and this is one of the goals of the coaching program, is it starts to feel like this is the foundation from which I live my life. And if I don't have it, it's like a one of the legs of a three-legged stool. If I don't have it, and I would say the other legs are supportive community and healthy relationships, and then others kind of self-care things that we have. if I don't have it, that stool starts to fall over. And my life starts to fall, well, I wouldn't say fall apart, but it goes back to those old patterns.
Yeah.
And that's where I know that we've been able to help that person do something that's going to be a benefit for the rest of their life.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
So the other piece is that I think, to your comment about it being predictable, is invariably people's most intimate relationships change, and they get clarity. And sometimes that clarity is, really positive and for the better. And sometimes that clarity is, I need to move out of this relationship. And I work really hard to not be attached to what that outcome should be. I want that to be the person's own experience of discernment and guidance by the Spirit to decide that. And then the other piece is, some clarity about a higher purpose that they can start to bring into a professional context as well. Yeah. And then if I really want to get in the weeds, the lower stress and anxiety, just to geek out for a second, I actually did team up with a psychologist and a statistician to do a validation study of the survey of the assessment tool that I use. And we found that people who were more centered, so in the language of Centering for Wisdom, they were less reactive to those triggers that life throws at us, that a narcissist is going to throw at us, like to get us to punch the tar baby again.
Yeah. That
the more centered people were, they had it was a 26% lower stress, 27% lower anxiety, and 20% fewer symptoms of depression by doing that. Nice. So there were real health benefits that we saw as well for people who scored lower on the assessment.
That's an awesome report. I didn't know you had that information. That's, I think we're all shooting for that here on this conference. Like everyone here, it's like they've been through a war zone. So a lot of people on this call have
trauma.
Yeah, trauma. CPTSD is the term that they may be experiencing.
Sorry, what does the C stand for?
Complex.
Oh, complex as opposed to acute. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the type of PTSD that you acquire over time of consistent abuse over time.
Yeah.
So I think this would be an amazing tool for those folks. Let me check on the time here. Just want to make sure we're good. We're good. Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, my kids are at the dentist, so I'm free for a while.
I have another interview in a little while, but I have a little more time too. So is there anything else you want to share? Keeping in mind who our audience is, we've got moms and dads out there that have been through abuse, children of narcissists, employees, and what is something they can do tonight? What can they do tonight to step on that path of everything we've been talking about? To step on the path.
Yeah. Well, I guess if I'm thinking in terms of my own approach to centering for wisdom that I've been talking about, would be to look for some kind of a spiritual practice that gets you in touch with that core of wisdom and goodness and strength. I think you will be putting up a link where people can go and see. I have some guided meditations and interviews and some courses on Insight Timer, which is an app. It's the world's largest meditation app. I think there's close to not 10 million people who have downloaded it at this point.
Oh, wow.
So there are some guided meditations in there that people could do. I don't believe that any one of those meditations is specifically focused on working with a narcissist, like in that sense. But in terms of being introduced to a spiritual practice, that would be a quick and easy thing that people could find.
So, look, we've already been focused on the narcissist enough. We don't need a meditation about him, right? So,
yeah, that's right. Well, if what I meant by that was how you disentangle from that in a spiritual practice. But I think anything, so look, I teach this process of centering, prayer, and meditation because that's my primary practice. I've been doing it for 25 years. I am certified or commissioned, as we call it, to teach out of that. So I feel competent to do that. But I would also add that anything that gets you in touch with that inner core of wisdom and goodness and power, and in touch with some kind of higher power, however you define that, is going to put you on the path of that process. So, I'm a firm believer that I think this comes out of the Buddhist tradition, but the whole idea that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and when the time is right for us to take that step and put our trust in a spiritual teacher, and that is a really intimate, powerful, sacred relationship.
Sure is.
People are led to the kind of teacher and person that they feel comfortable with. So, if that's me to people who are out there, great. And if it's not, then I don't think I'm a narcissist. Go find somebody else who will help you, because that's what I want for people. And there are different, practices and traditions, but certainly, I guess I would add too, I mentioned earlier the importance of this being not just a rational exercise, but a fully embodied exercise. I also, as part of my own process, incorporate the practice of yoga, and have studied with yoga teachers in the Himalayan yoga tradition, and have received an initiation in that process as well. And so I really find that combination and that integration of the body is really powerful. Interestingly, Bessel van der Kolk, who you might be familiar with, he's kind of the leading researcher on trauma and recovery right now, I think, in the world, especially with combat veterans, does almost exclusively yoga therapy with people at this point, because that's like him. He's a psychiatrist. He's all about like hardcore, validated scientific research, looking at how the brain changes. Nice. So there are different paths into that.
Can you put his name in the chat there so I can take a look at him? Yeah. And
yes. Do you want me to do that right now, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll grab it.
Yeah.
So I want to just quickly. It probably won't be quick, but let's try.
We're not good at that.
Let's address this though. So a lot of people on this conference, it could be the case that they have been abused by religion. I was one of those people.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that I kept seeking something anyway. I'm an ordained minister and a Reiki master, and I love loving people, and I love my relationship with God. But I could have went a whole different direction. And I know people who have. And the thing is, the narcissist shows up, and like Sam Bachman says in his interview with me, so you guys want to make sure you go watch that. He says a lot, it's 2 hours. But he mentions the narcissist, you want to go watch this, Tom, the way he describes it. I can't do any justice to it, but I just want to say this. As a little child, the narcissist makes an agreement, basically. He dumps himself out so he can be God. And so he has no ego, he has no self. And so he grows up trying to, look at me and all that. And picking up his own tools to survive as being this empty character. And they show up in your life. And I don't know if I'm going to speak to this appropriately, but I'm going to try. So forgive me if.
Well, no, I'm with you. And I think I know where you're going. So please continue. Yeah.
So they enter your life and you empty into them every single day. This is you. You're emptying into their vessel every single day. And they're acting like they're God. Initially, it's okay because they're like so cute or so handsome or so fun or so loving or whatever, the love bombing situation, whatever it is. But then all the tricks start, the gaslighting, the triangulation, the isolating, the alienating, all of the flying monkeys, the puppeteering, the hovering, the hoovering, all of it happens. Now, this person gives up their relationship with God, even. They separate them from themselves. The narcissist separates the victim from their own self because every day you're pouring into them. So who's over here for you? And you've lost your
the ultimate violence.
It's so violent. It's and then when they discard you, you have no God to even rely on because you've separated yourself
Yeah.
from everybody and everything.
Yeah.
So that person may be showing up to this conversation and hearing the word God, God, God. And this is not the first conversation that we've had. And it's not the first time I've described this in this conference, just so you know. I just want to repeat it. I
Yeah.
I think the quickest way to get your life back is to repair your relationship with yourself, which means repairing your relationship with God.
I'm so glad you brought this up.
Good.
So, because it's so important. And, so, I mean, like, I'm fully going to own it, right? I have a PhD in theology and ethics. The practice can be taught and adapted for any practice or tradition. It does come out of the Christian tradition initially. And I want to be fully, transparent about that at the beginning. What I find fascinating about this time that we live in, and this is just bracket the narcissist piece. We're living through a time of just radical mistrust of religious tradition, particularly in the West and of Christianity. I think there's still maybe a little bit more like novelty and curiosity around Buddhism and Eastern traditions and yoga. But even there, if you aren't familiar with it, you can dig in pretty quick and find all the yoga teachers that have sexually abused their students. I mean, it's endemic to spiritual power, right? It's not unique to the Christian tradition. But regardless of that, we're living through a period of just radical distrust in the church, in religious traditions. And I for whatever reason, I don't know, it's this weird path that I guess I've been put on. I have had plenty of my frustrations. I have never actually left my home tradition, which was growing up Catholic and Christian. But for some reason, I am radically sympathetic to people who struggle with that. And particularly what I find is that the people that I end up working with and who are drawn to me are people who are super frustrated with the church. And I don't just mean the Catholic Church, I mean church in lots of different ways. And pastors and spiritual leaders can fall into these narcissistic patterns. Sure. And damage people deeply in the same way that anybody with power can. So what I find, though, is that a lot of people who I end up working with are people who just can't go back and don't want to go back to that formal relationship with the church. And not all, but many, but don't want to give up. They're like, it's not that I don't believe in God or that I don't believe in a power greater than myself. It's not that I don't want to have a spiritual life. I just don't trust myself to do that in that context. Mm. And so I think when you add in the trauma and abuse of being with a narcissist, that becomes an even more delicate and tender balance. And here again is where I try really hard as a coach to not impose what my own view of the world, my own spiritual beliefs onto anybody that I work with, but to offer a practice that we can all meet up in and see where that guides people. And it can guide them, into refining their understanding and often rediscovering a relationship with something bigger than themselves. You don't even have to call it God. I mean, I get it. That word can be a trigger for people, but something bigger than themselves, or as you put it, that true self within, ultimately that is the space that we meet God anyways. Yeah. So if we can get in touch with that, we are getting in touch with a higher power, something bigger than ourselves. So for me, it's that, I don't know, I hope and strive to create a space where it's safe for that part of people to come out and play and explore, and for that to be a healing experience.
So I was just going to ask what your wish for the audience was, but I think I just heard it.
Yeah, probably. And maybe combined with what we said earlier, which is, what's one thing you can do right now, tonight, to allow that that higher self within, that wisdom within to come out and play and to see where that takes you. So that could be, if people go to Insight Timer, there'll be a link to my teacher page that has all of my guided meditations and talks. But there are, I don't even know, probably close to 10,000 teachers on Insight Timer from every possible tradition that you could think of. So, just to go and do one thing that opens the door of that possibility for hope and healing.
And that door is
And
right
then
here.
yeah, exactly. It's right here. You have what you need.
Yeah.
It's just the courage that can come from these kinds of conversations. And thank you for creating the space for this dialogue in this community so that we can,
sure,
invite each other out of those damaging relationships. Because I always say we start out doing this for ourselves and we end up sticking with it to pay it forward.
Yeah,
Because
that's what happened here.
yeah.
I'm sure that happened with you too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, when I was in the thick of it, there's no way in hell I would have been offering a coaching program. I was a hot mess. I couldn't help other people. But I needed to go through that. And again, that's where I can see the grace in retrospect, that it enables that ability to pull it forward. And so people that are watching, you may very well, I would say you do have that in you. And it's just the courage to pull that one thread, and it's just one step at a time, and trusting that you'll be guided to a better spot.
I agree that we've pulled together a tribe here. Tom's part of the tribe. I'm going to list some links in the Zoom room and also in the Facebook Live, so you'll know how to connect with him. And homework tonight, go listen to one of his guided meditations. Pick out the perfect one for you. Take a listen to it. Tom, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thank you, Mary. And again, thank you for putting this together and sharing this, because I know so many people are going to benefit from it.
Me too. High five. I agree.
All right.